I hope everyone enjoyed your meal. We have dessert coming out soon. In the meantime, we do have a guest speaker today to talk to you about veterans and about his newest book, Where Do We Find Such Men? I'll introduce him now, Mr. Bob Going.
Hi.
How are you?
Listen, if you start getting, if I'm going too long, just start talking among yourselves and I'll get the message pretty quick. I spent about 5 years writing this book. It finally got published in May, and this is actually, believe it or not, the first public appearance I've given on this book. So if I look a little nervous, it's because 40 years in radio and on stage, I still get stage fright. Where do we find such men? It's about Amsterdam in World War II, at home and abroad. And the research involved reading every single page of the Amsterdam Recorder from 1941 through 1946 and taking copious notes and going back and finding stories and then tracking down a few people that were still around who could remember some of these stories and give me some more details, and some friends and friends of friends filling me in on stuff. The cover is a photograph of Alan Pelekis from Hageman, and it's a picture of him jauntily walking up Chuckton Street in Hageman before the war, pretty much in front of his family homestead. And he was like everybody else in this book, just a guy from Amsterdam High School who ended up on Guam and in Iwo Jima, where he won a Silver Star and was killed. And at 22, he never came home. The one thing I didn't have for the first 4 years that I was working on this book was a title. And I came up finally with this title when I was watching a Ronald Reagan documentary on one of the History channels. And they were reviewing his trip to Normandy on the 40th anniversary of D-Day. And this was what Reagan said when he got home. They were what General Marshall called our secret weapon, the best damn kids in the world. Where do we find them? Where do we find such men? And the answer came almost as quickly as I asked the question. Where we've always found them in this country, in the farms, the shops, the stores, and the offices. They just are the product of the freest society the world has ever known. The one thing that I found extremely remarkable in my research is how much of World War II depended on the men of Amsterdam. Just about every step of the way, from Pearl Harbor to the Bataan Death March to Nagasaki to the Nuremberg war trials, somebody from Amsterdam was there. D-Day, Battle of the Bulge. Over 180 men from this area were killed in World War II. 180. In 12 years of Vietnam, there were like a dozen from this area. It got to the point where the newspapers, you'd almost get numb reading them. There'd be 3 a day, especially in 1944 and 45. And we kind of forget that now because it's so far removed. Of course, I never remembered it. I was born 6 years after the war ended. But the war for me was always part of my life growing up in the 50s. Because our fathers would talk about it among themselves, not to us. If we got lucky, we overheard it, you know, and sometimes we'd ask questions like, how come that man only has one leg? And they'd tell us, you know, it was the war. And we'd accept that as it was. But we grew up knowing all these fathers of my contemporaries who were incredible heroes during the war. And they never talked about it. We never knew about it. I've got people in this book that have got, one of them had 12 kids, and not one of them knew anything about what his father did on Saipan. For Amsterdam, this had to be the most patriotic city in the United States. I start off the book pretty much with a parade in 1940, October 23rd, 1940. Now mind you, this is a year before Pearl Harbor and a couple of months. Company G from the Armory, our local militia, about 83 guys, were called up along with all the other militias around the country for 1 year of federal service, 1 year of training. This town threw a parade that has never been matched. 30,000 people showed up as these guys marched from the Armory and through downtown Amsterdam and back to the train station to get on the train to go to Alabama for 1 year of training. That 1 year in 1940 lasted until pretty much August of 1945 for most of them. Others transferred out, they were killed along the way. A substantial number, probably half the guys from Company G ended up either killed or wounded during the war, one way or another. And that was just a small portion. But can you imagine the fervor of this community? They shut down the post office for the afternoon so the postal workers could participate in the parade. Every store in town was closed. Bands were playing. Other troop trains were coming through, and they would stop as they were coming through Amsterdam, and everybody would cheer, and they'd play songs for them as they went on. And those guys didn't, most of them didn't actually get into the fighting for 4 more years after that. And then they're just thrown into Saipan, and in the first 24 hours, half of Company G was killed or wounded. And then they fought for another 3 weeks. And then they're part of this incredible bonsai charge that the Japanese had, where they had like 3,000 or 4,000 men left alive, and they all gathered, they got sticks and guns, whatever they had available, swords, and they went charging at midnight against the lines of these guys from upstate New York. These were guys who were working in the mills. These guys who were in the bowling leagues and were playing pickup basketball games when they were here. And all of a sudden, they're fighting for their lives. Company G left 500 dead Japanese in front of them, and they weren't even in the height of the action. And if that wasn't enough, they went on to Okinawa. And anybody who wasn't killed or wounded up to that point got it again.
Okay.
Anyway, that's just one portion of my book. I don't think I touch 5% of the stories of Amsterdam in World War II in this book, and I had to cut it at 366 pages, and I'm sure I got enough stories for another volume coming up. But to me, it is just absolutely incredible what everybody did. There were 3 Distinguished Service Crosses from this town, the nation's second highest honor, beyond the Congressional Medal of Honor. More Silver Stars than I could count. Bronze Stars for bravery were so many that I only included 1 or 2 of them in this book. And on and on and on. And then I've got the story of the Bigelow Sanford United's soccer club. These guys were, you knew most of them, the Campbells and the McKnights and the Dines and the Tolsons and all these people that later became office holders, aldermen and mayoral candidates and things like that over the years. They played soccer before the war. They were playing in a they were amateurs playing in a professional soccer league, and on December 7th, 1941, they were fighting for the state title. And in the middle of the game, they're told about the bombing. And all the excitement left the field. They just played quietly the rest of the game and just walked off. And before 2 months had gone by, most of them were in the service, and their younger brothers were finishing up the soccer season and won the title, the professional title with an amateur team. They didn't play again until 1946. Johnny Campbell later served as alderman, ran for mayor a couple of times, about as successful as Pope Reedy in that regard. I knew John Campbell as a guy running for mayor when I was a youngster. I had no idea that in 1943 or early 44, I guess, on the island of Macon, the Gilbert Islands, he was leading a group of guys from Gloversville. He was a second lieutenant at the time. In their first combat on the island of Macon. And this Japanese officer approaches him with a sword over his head. Campbell assumes he's surrendering, and he marches forward to receive his surrender sword and gets the sword sliced through his wrist and into his foot. He never played soccer again. But it didn't stop him from coming back in the war. He was in Saipan and later action as well. Trying to play basketball against the Fighting 69th, dragging his foot along that never recovered. And the war's over, they come back, they resume playing. Campbell can't play, so he becomes the manager of the team. And they come back as though nothing at all had happened. Fortunately, they left a newsletter behind. Beginning in 1943, they put out, the people back home put out a newsletter for them, and the guys around the world would write back home, and their letters would be in the newsletter and would go out to everybody else. So they were able to find out what all their friends were doing and what the folks back home were doing. And that kept them all together, notwithstanding one of them was up building the Alcan Highway, another guy was in Iceland, a bunch of them were at D-Day, a bunch of them went up through Italy. You name it, Pierce Paulson is putting out a fire in his airplane when they're under control with his bare hands. He had nothing else to extinguish the fire from as it was about to hit their bomb load. These are guys who were just us. And not everybody, of course, who served ended up in situations where they would be considered heroic. Most of them just did their duty, whatever it was. One of the fellows, in the course of my research, I came across the yearbook picture for John Wojcik, John S. Wojcik, class of 1939 at Wilbur Lynch. They used to put quotes under everybody's picture. The quote they picked for him, mind you, this is 2 years plus before the war begins. Everyone who does his best is a hero. You didn't have to be on the front lines. There were guys that were working at desks. There were guys who were moving supplies around. There were people guarding the ships that were going to Murmansk in the Arctic Ocean. Everyone who does his best is a hero. Did any of these people expect what was going to happen to them? Nobody even knew where they were going. I've got a big section of the book of that is the actual journal of Edward Hartigan, whose father had been the chief of detectives in the city of Amsterdam. He was 39 years old when he goes to boot camp. 39. He was twice as old as all these other guys who are going through it, and they're hitting the ground, and he's getting black and blue and all this stuff. He ends up in Merrill's Marauders. fortunately with a desk job, but sent out to India after having just been hanging around Amsterdam all his life. And he didn't have to go, he was 39. But he went. Everybody went. My father went. You know, my father was the only son of a widowed mother. He probably could have got an exemption of some sort. He didn't. His father had been in World War I. He went, joined the Navy, terrible eyesight, couldn't do anything. You wouldn't trust him with a gun, believe me, because he couldn't see a thing. So he ends up a clerk, and he's in Cherbourg, France, 2 weeks after D-Day. I've got a letter he wrote home to his mother. Don't worry. Oh, don't worry. Everything's cool, you know. And then you pick up the newspaper from that same period, and all these guys, including classmates of his, were killed or wounded in the newspaper every single day. Don't worry, Mom. That's what they all said. Don't worry. Everything's cool. I have a letter from Paul Romeo. You might remember him. He ran Paul's Confectionery on Grove Street, next to the St. Mary's Convent for years. He had one eye. He lost the other one in Italy. And his letter home to his mother says, hey, don't worry, Ma, I had the operation last week. It's okay, they took the eye out. You won't even notice it when I get home. Gee. Steve Rutkowski, a good friend of my parents. His wife worked with my mother at St. Mary's Institute. She was a school librarian there. I think she, if I recall correctly, she was his nurse as he was recovering. He goes ashore after D-Day. He's part of that push through the hedgerow country of Normandy, where every foot of ground is fought over in a deadly fashion. These fields were like, 100 yards long, and they had to clear out the Germans at the other end who were firing mortars at them and everything else. And it was field by field, foot by foot, yard by yard, mile by mile, until they finally made this breakthrough. And he's, I think, a first lieutenant at the time, and he's leading, he had lost a brother, too, in the war. He's leading his platoon, looking to hook up around the Moselle River someplace, gets hit in the arm, gets hit in the leg, gets hit in both legs. He can't move at all. He crawls as far as he can, but he maintained control of his platoon, got them organized, set up defensive positions, and stayed there for hours bleeding with what turned out to be one leg missing until everything was under control, and then he allowed them to take him away. He danced the polka at my wedding with his wooden leg. I mean, the only thing he told me about the war was he got to meet General Patton, who came and awarded him a captaincy while he was lying in a hospital bed. That was his story of the war, not about the sacrifice he made. And he was just like everybody else. The book is full of these things, and it just leaves me in awe. And I know I'm just, we're approaching Veterans Day. I should be talking about the veterans of all wars, but I guess what I'm saying is, where do we find such men? We find them right here in Amsterdam, New York, in World War II and World War I, going back to the Civil War, even earlier. Is it the air here? Is it the water? Is it what? Maybe every other community in the United States is just like ours. Maybe. But what we have is pretty darn terrific. And anybody who hasn't told their stories yet, please do. Because somebody else 20 years from now is going to be wanting to write your stories. It's probably not going to be me. I know you're not talking yet, but would you like to hear a passage? Maybe? Let me put this. You hold that for a second. It's tough to do this.
You maybe need an assistant.
Enough of all the killing and everything else. I wanted to talk about the end of the war in Amsterdam. War's swift end becomes quite obvious after Hiroshima, and the exclamation point of Nagasaki begins the countdown. Amsterdam readies itself for the explosion to come, with the merchants chipping in to buy brand new 48-star flags to line downtown, and factory and retail holidays being planned, and police department contingencies developed. Some of the older members of the force can recall the 1918 festivities that had ended with an unfortunate homicide. Most important of all, the city's noisemakers are firmly in place. Promptly at 7 p.m. on August 14th, 1945, the flash comes over the AP wire at the Evening Recorder. Immediately, the newspaper passes the word to Superintendent James Donnelly at the Bigelow Sanford plant and to the Central Fire Station on Pearl Street. The huge siren at the carpet mill goes off, and audible fire traffic signals at street intersection. Other mills join the cacophony. The chimes at St. Mary's Church begin to play, and every church bell in town rings gloriously. Front doors fly open, neighbors hug, and tears flow. Everyone heads for downtown, on foot, or much more slowly by car, as the roads to downtown quickly back up a mile or more. Now the big whistle at the Chalmers knitting mill takes over, blowing exultantly for a half hour or more, barely heard above the din of honking horns. Kids jump on the hoods of cars, homemade confetti appears spontaneously, and the various drum and bugle corps from the local veterans groups start to make their own impromptu parades. A Mohawk Mills truck appears with a quickly assembled brass band playing patriotic airs. Horns, cowbells, housewives bashing pie tins all add to the merriment. Over at the New York Telephone Company, every available operator reports for duty to handle the 50,000 local calls and double the usual number of long-distance calls. Some wait as long as a half hour to get their turn. Reporters wonder who could be making all those calls, since the entire universe seems to be on Main Street. It won't stop. The Fort Johnson all-girl drum corps arrives, and the WBA girls drum corps. Even Adolf Hitler shows up, or at least some Amsterdamian looking like him being carried around as one of our country's trophies. What's he doing here, some of the biddies want to know. The tumult continues downtown past midnight, and then spreads to the neighborhoods where non-regulated fireworks and drinking and laughing and cheering go on until heavy rains at 2:30 in the morning finally drive everyone indoors. By then, the Bergen Post boys had marched to the Wyszomierski Post to salute their comrades, and together they continue to salute to the last man standing. The next morning breaks calmly, quietly, serenely. The only sounds heard are of municipal workers cleaning up the streets and parishioners of the 7 Catholic churches heading for Mass on the Feast of the Assumption. By order of Bishop Gibbons, the Blessed Sacrament remains exposed for Thanksgiving prayers after the last Mass in each church for the remainder of the day. The various Protestant churches open their doors as well and celebrate services of gratitude to the Almighty for the war's end. And in an otherwise deserted downtown, nameless volunteers carefully and proudly unveil the new American flags. No doubt a few of them recalling the refrain from John Philip Sousa's most famous march. Hurrah for the flag of the free. May it wave as our standard forever, the gem of the land and the sea, the banner of the right. Let despots remember the day when our fathers with mighty endeavor proclaimed as they marched to the fray that by their might and by their right it waves forever. Let's one more time. I just want to finish up with my dedication to the book, which is to my father, and I'm only doing this not because it's to my father, but because it represents really my dedication to all the men who have ever served, and women who have ever served their country. In loving memory of Francis J. Goings, storekeeper, second class, U.S. Naval Reserve. For historians, his life is of little interest. From 1942 through 1945, he did his duty every day to the best of his ability, and then he came home. Thank God such men were born.